Hello everyone, I am Technical Sergeant Alexandro Caraballo. I am with the 366 Fighter Wing Equal Opportunity Office, and today I will be giving you your Newcomers Orientation and First Duty Station Airmen Equal Opportunity Briefing. The Equal Opportunity Office here can be found in the Education Center, or if you're unfamiliar with where that is, it is across the street from the bowling alley, right next to the dorms and as well as the lodging facilities. We're located on the third floor. We share the space with the Special Victims Council and the SAPR office. It's pretty quiet, so please come by anytime. We have a free snack bar, free coffee, water. There's a relaxation room down the hall, so it's a very welcoming environment. We try to keep it as relaxing as possible, and it's very private, so you don't have to worry about anyone possibly seeing you go in and out of our office. So please feel free to visit, ask questions, converse with us. We're here for you all. All right, so here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover statutes and policies. So a lot of this information is going to sound familiar, look familiar. We're going to cover the complaint process, and here's where it becomes a little bit more important to pay attention because it does differ between military and civilian members, and each party has certain benefits, if you will. We're also going to cover local data and trends, what's going on Mountain Home Air Force Base, what's going on in the local area, what's going on in the city of Mountain Home, Boise, Meridian, Twin Falls, you name it. We're going to kind of look at all of that. And then we're going to end with roles and responsibilities. So starting with statutes and policies. What is equal opportunity? What do you all know that to be? It's kind of built into the name. Basically, we are here to ensure that everyone can go to work and not have to worry about institutional barriers, unlawful discrimination, bullying, hazing. That is our main objective. A lot of people think we go out looking for issues, and that's not necessarily the case. We want everyone to have basically an agency to go to, and that is us, to say, hey, this is what's going on. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's fair. And our job is to basically remain neutral. We simply look at the facts. We gather the facts. We talk to the complainants. We will talk to witnesses, alleged offenders, you name it. And then ultimately, it's not even us that recommends any sort of disciplinary action. That is completely up to those commanders that we are working with. So just a little brief objective of what we do here. We also take care of a lot of variety of other things, such as the climate surveys that you may take on an annual basis when you have a new commander or 1 year thereafter. We do team building. We do mediation, facilitation. We do a lot of different things that people probably are not familiar with. So, all right, so let's talk about the DoD policy. The DoD policy basically says, if you look at the first paragraph there in red, individuals should be considered for positions or jobs based off their merit, fitness, and capability. And when I use the word job, I'm talking about TDYs, certain assignments within your career field, possibly outside your career field. We're talking about deployments, you name it. We're talking about a lot of different things there when we use the word job. But that is how you should be evaluated. It shouldn't necessarily come down to the color of your skin, your relationship with someone. It shouldn't be that way. And the DoD policy is written that way intentionally. If you look at that second paragraph there in red, it covers 6 protected categories, but I'm going to only briefly touch on those. So at the foundation of the Equal Opportunity Program, we are protected on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and national origin. However, on this next slide, you'll notice that the Air Force goes a little bit more in depth with their protected categories. So again, race, color, religion, sex. Under sex discrimination, that includes sexual harassment and pregnancy, national origin, sexual orientation, and as of February 2019, the Equal Opportunity Program actually took over bullying and hazing as a basis of protection. So keep that in mind. This pertains to all military and civilian members. However, if you look at that second paragraph, there are 4 additional protected categories, and those are for civilian only. Age over the age of 40, disability, mental or physical, reprisal or retaliation for seeking EO guidance, counsel, you name it, and genetic information. The federal government cannot ask civilian employees for the genetic information if it has nothing to do with the job. Now, if you look at the 366 Fighter Wing Commander Equal Opportunity Policy, you'll see bolded right there it says, ignoring or tolerating the behavior is the same as actively discriminating. What that ultimately means is if you see something, say something. Basically, if you were around unlawful discrimination, bullying, hazing, sexual harassment, you name it, and you did nothing, and if the allegations are serious enough, commanders could potentially view you as a participant rather than a witness. Moving forward, let's talk about the Title VII Civil Rights Act of 1964. Think of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. One of the big things that come out of that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And at the time, it covered race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. We refer to this as kind of the foundation of the Equal Opportunity Program within the armed services. And, of course, over time, it's evolved and more things have been added, verbiage has changed, things like that. Moving on to the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967. This act protects individuals who are 40 years of age or older from employment discrimination based off their age. It can apply to any of those areas you see there in front of you. Typically, how I have seen it here on this base is people will look at civilian employees and jokingly make comments such as, hey, how did they do it in Stone Age? Or you're so old school, or things of that nature. Sometimes they'll even refer to them like, hey, when do you plan on retiring? Or things like that. And honestly, when it comes down to equal opportunity complaints, it's a lot of perception-based things going on. So if the individual feels that they are being pressured to retire or they won't be considered for certain positions because of their age, they can file a complaint on that. Now let's talk about Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act of 2008. This is one of the newest policies in the equal opportunity realm. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of genetic information. Again, for any of those categories you see there in front of you, the list is not exhaustive by any means, and it can be applied to a variety of other areas, but this is typically the most common ways the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, sees these complaints. Now, moving on to the complaint processes. Again, I can't stress this enough. It does differ between military and civilian employees. So let's talk about what the process is to begin with. In the Air Force, we're a pretty unique entity. We take care of all military members, to include family members. So if anything happens on base, we kind of need to know about it if someone wants to file a complaint. For civilian employees, we take care of anyone that's a GS, NAF employee. We're only really limited to those individuals because when it comes to contractors, we really have to work through that contracted agency if anything happens. So please keep that in mind if you are a contracted employee. Members are encouraged to use the chain of command, and we are going to talk about that a lot here. Because it is very important to try to utilize your chain of command. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So let's talk about the military informal complaint. Think of this as low-level resolution. So again, working with your chain of command. And this can be your immediate supervisor. It can be your supervisor, the first sergeant, your commander, whoever you ultimately choose to work your concerns. So in this process, there are pros and cons, right? One of the big pros to working with your chain of command is they can look into things where the equal opportunity cannot. So we are limited to our purview. So once again, we cannot go outside the means of unlawful discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, national origin, and bullying and hazing. Whereas someone in your chain of command can actually look into concerns of maybe abuse of authority or abuse of power, whereas that's more IG's lane. And so your commander has that ability to look into basically any of your allegations and consult with EO, IG, JA, legal, whatever the case may be. They have that authority, whereas we are strictly limited to our purview. So in this process, you can do a lot of different things. You can write a letter to the individual you're having concerns with. You can speak to them with someone next to you. Maybe that's your supervisor, unless the issue is with your supervisor, and working your way up that chain of command. One of the unique programs we have in the Air Force is the alternate dispute resolution. Earlier, I talked about how our office can mediate concerns. What I did not tell you is we're all certified to do so. We're trained in our technical training to be mediators and how to facilitate a conversation and hopefully reach an agreed upon resolution. However, if that doesn't occur, the unique thing about the military informal complaint process is if things don't turn out the way you had hoped, or nothing happens, or you're just not satisfied with the process, you can file a formal complaint, in which case we kind of take over. And I'll get to that right now. So in the military formal complaint process, we are essentially conducting any clarification. So we're talking to you, we're talking to the alleged offender, or attempting to rather, and then we're also going to talk to any witnesses that are identified and try to paint a picture. And we're basing our decision off the preponderance of evidence standard. And essentially what that means is, did the allegations most likely occur? And if we say yes, we send our paperwork off to JA. JA is going to review our work and ensure that we didn't leave any stone unturned, if you will, and they will either concur or not concur with us. In the event they concur with us, we will send the report to the alleged offender's commander. That commander then has 5 days to take action. Again, we're neutral, so we don't recommend what action is taken. After that 5 days, the commander gets that report back to us, and we process it, and in 30 days, we follow up with the complainant and figure out, hey, are things better? Are they worse? Are they the same? What's going on? And we will review further guidance from there on. In the event that legal does not concur with our findings, Colonel Goodman is actually the individual who is the final authority. So he'll basically either say, I concur with EO or I concur with JA. And then basically the process remains the same. It goes to the alleged offender's commander, that commander take action, so on and so forth. So moving on to civilian complaints. Now, one of the biggest differences here is civilian complainants must start in the informal process, whereas military members have the option. They can choose informal or formal. Civilian complainants have to start in the informal process and try to resolve any of their concerns at the lowest possible level. So, once again, you're going to come to us. We're going to see who the responsible management official is, and we're going to try to achieve resolution through that responsible management official and the complainant. We will still offer alternate dispute resolution. Now, what I didn't mention earlier is that ADR is voluntary. So it's agreed upon by the complainant and the alleged offender or the responsible management official. So if one side agrees to it, great. But if the other half doesn't, we don't do it. So that's kind of a give and take there. So if you want to go to the table, understand that the other party may not be willing to do so. Keep that in mind. Now, where it becomes a very big difference between military and civilian complaints is the formal process. Where EO would typically be heavily involved in the formal process, we are not for civilian complaints. And the reason for that is we work directly for the agency, if you will. We work directly for Colonel Goodman. We work directly for the Air Force. So in a way to maintain a neutral process, the Air Force defers formal complaints out to the Investigation and Resolutions Division, IRD, and they then work with the Air Force Civilian Review Office, and they determine if discrimination occurs. And they still are appeals rights and so on and so forth, and it can get very tedious, as some of these complaints that I have seen can range from anywhere from 120 days to 3, 4, 5 years even. So we try to resolve civilian complaints at that lowest level for that reason, and we do the same thing for military members. So again, when you come to us and we say, hey, have you talked to your chain of command? Just know that we're not trying to push you away. We're just trying to make sure that you will understand what options you have available. Now, one thing I didn't talk about before I move on is civilian complainants have the right to anonymity. Military members do not. However, information is still held to those with a need to know. So keep that in mind. Now let's talk about the timeline requirements. There are some timeline requirements. If you want to file an informal complaint as a military member, there's essentially no timeline restrictions. The only kind of rule of thumb here is you need to be under an Air Force contract. So if you're in the delayed entry program, great, you can file an informal complaint with your chain of command. However, if you want to file a formal complaint with us, you need to come to us within 60 days of the last alleged offense. And for civilian employees, please come to us within 45 days of the last alleged offense. Moving on, let's cover local data and trends. What's going on here on Mountain Home Air Force Base? So let's talk about on-base EO trends. Here we've seen gender discrimination quite often. So comments, if you will. We're seeing a lot of inappropriate jokes, comments, things of that nature. For example, one of the things that we have seen, we'd have men that will come into our office and say, hey, I was at work and I thought it was kind of weird that all these people were kind of amazed that I could do my job well, considering I was never mechanically inclined, or things of that nature. And the same logic can be applied to women in our work centers who have possibly experienced something similar. Now, when it comes to sexual harassment, we've seen this a few different ways and from both sides. One example I can tell you all about is there was an airman that came to my office. She was an NCO, and she was on her way to lunch one day. And as she was leaving the parking lot, her male senior NCO boss flagged her down and said, "Hey, do you mind if I go to lunch with you?" She says, "No, it's no big deal." So he gets in the car and they begin to drive off. As they're driving, she makes the joke, "Hey, as long as I'm driving, I think you should pay." And he said, "Yeah, of course. But first you have to give me a hand job." And so when he said that and made that comment, it made her very uncomfortable, especially being in a confined environment. So she came to our office and said, "Hey, what are my options?" We told her what was available to her. And so she opted to file an informal complaint. And when sexual harassment is alleged in the informal process, the commander has to conduct what is known as a commander-directed investigation, or CDI. During that process, an individual outside of the unit, often an E7 or above or an O3 and above, is appointed who has no knowledge of any of the parties involved, and they are basically in charge of running things. So they will talk to the complainant, they will talk to witnesses, they will attempt to speak to the alleged offender. And typically, what we would do in the military formal complaint, this investigating officer is going to do this in the informal process. Now, another way we've seen it in this office is a new male employee was hired into a squadron new to the entire civil service world. So one day he was coming into work, and his supervisor, a female, commented on his appearance and the way he smelt, and he thought at first she was just being friendly, and he thanked her and he moved on with his day. However, it became a common occurrence and it started making him a little bit uncomfortable. So he began speaking about his spouse and what they did on the weekend and so forth, figuring, or hoping rather, that this would deter this female supervisor's actions. And unfortunately, that didn't work. It actually became more aggressive. One day, she actually walked up to him, took a photo of him with her phone, and as she was walking away, she said, "I'm going to save this for later." And it was at that moment he was like, "Wow, that's very strange. I don't know what she means by that." There's an innuendo involved. So still new to this civil service world, doesn't know quite what to do. So he takes a little bit more time and thinks everything's going to be normal and everything will kind of level out. Unfortunately, that was not the case. One day, he's having a midterm feedback with his supervisor, and she began to reach over the table and hold his hand. And it was at this point he was like, "Okay, this is a bit much. Red flags are going off left and right." And he comes to our office and tells us what's going on. And as a civilian employee, we have to try to resolve this at that lowest level possible first. And we notify the commander. This individual waives his right to anonymity. The commander is able to take action. And ultimately, this individual just wanted the behavior to stop. And by working with his commander and just letting him know that he just wanted a normal, healthy working environment, the commander was able to provide that. And that individual, the civilian supervisor, was suspended ultimately without pay. And that may not seem like a lot, but it is for a civilian employee. A suspension stays on the record. It's very similar to an LOR or an Article 15 as military individuals. Now, when I talk about perceived disparaging terms, I want you all to think about words that possibly have a double meaning. And this is where it becomes imperative that you understand those around you. You have some sort of relationship. Here's an example. I was conducting a training not too long ago, and it was about generational differences in the workplace. And this individual kept saying snowflakes. And myself, where I grew up, snowflakes was a derogatory term towards white Americans. And so I was like kind of floored by this, not quite sure how to process it. However, I allowed him to continue speaking. And then I realized as he was talking that, oh, he's using the word snowflake as unique individuals, and how the younger generations are different, and they just think differently, they act differently, and they're just not the same as even their peers. And so it took me a while and just really carefully listening before I corrected him to understand that his intent had a different impact than what I originally was interpreting. So be careful of these perceived disparaging terms. Try to know your audience and try to converse with one another if something is said and you're kind of not sure how to process it. And as for inappropriate behavior observed on social media accounts, the big thing here to remember is be careful of what you're putting out there. And even this boils down to the comments. Be careful what you say. There's nothing wrong with voicing your opinion or things of that nature, but it can be wrong if you start to identify basis of discrimination or immutable characteristics of individuals. So be careful what you're doing, because even if you think you're doing it on your personal, private Facebook, someone might get a hold of it, post it somewhere else, and then it could be very detrimental to your careers. So please be careful. As for off base, in 2018 and 2019, for that matter, there were 10 hate groups that were tracked in the state of Idaho. Now, that may seem like a lot, but in all honesty, that's not that bad based off other locations with a similar population. So if you look at the dot that is southwest in the state, that is actually Meridian, Idaho. And those are actually two dots that are overlapping. They're both quite similar. They are anti-Muslim and anti-refugee. Now, do not let this map deter you from going places in Idaho. I will say this much about Idahoans. They are extremely friendly and weirdly nice, if you will. Meaning, I can't even go get coffee without having to embrace a conversation about what I did on the weekend or what I plan on doing. So don't let this map deter you from doing that. Also, if you look in the upper panhandle of the state, that doesn't mean there's a cluster of hate groups in those areas. What it means is those populations are statewide, and although they may be close to those areas aren't necessarily associated entirely with hate groups. Now, if you look at equal opportunity treatment incidents, that essentially means we sit on that board where we examine off-limits areas and try to determine, hey, what's going on? Are people being treated equally? Are they being treated fairly? And so on and so forth. So if you ever go to a location that presents an uncomfortable, unlawful, or discriminatory practice, please let us know, and we can talk about that at the board and determine if that was an isolated incident or if it's a common occurrence, and maybe the base should consider making that area off-limits, if you will. Wrapping up this section of the briefing, we're going to end with prejudice and stereotypes. So these are kind of underlying influences that happen naturally in the mind. So let's start with prejudices, right? What is it? It's an adverse opinion or judgment formed beforehand without getting to know someone. So you're prejudging someone, if you will. And your prejudices come from a lot of different places. They can come from your parents, your family, friends, peers, life experiences, media, social media, religion. There are so many avenues where your prejudices can come from. And your prejudices are closely aligned to stereotypes. And stereotypes are kind of these fixed, rigid, overgeneralized, or oversimplifications about a person, group, or people. And they can have an adverse impact on our behavior, regardless of whether the implications are positive or negative. What's important to know here is it is natural to have stereotypes and prejudices in your mind occur, even without truly consciously thinking about them. However, where it can get you into a lot of hot water is if you act on them before getting to know people, before establishing relationships. That is what I advise you to be cautious of. Truly, get to know each other, get to know your peers, your supervisors, your subordinates, everyone around you, and understand that, like, hey, what are each other's boundaries? What are our backgrounds? What can we and can we not do? Ultimately, we want you all to have fun at work, but understand that there are limits to these things. Now, moving on to roles and responsibilities, let's cover kind of general guidelines, if you will. Try to set a positive example on and off duty. Confront inappropriate behavior, but my personal favorite is clarify perception versus fact. Now, again, we want you all to have fun, but understand those boundaries can be crossed sometimes, even if you had no ill intent. So, if you are offended, or if you feel you may have offended someone, simply clarify what you meant to say or what your intent behind it was, and determine why there was a disconnect in communication. Moving on, we're going to always encourage you to utilize your chain of command, but understand if you're not comfortable with that, there's a reason why. There's a military formal complaint process, and try to notify us within those specified timelines. Before I let you all go, I want to leave you with a quote by Maya Angelou. She once said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And this is a testament to truly trying to establish yourself on that first impression. And if you don't get it right the first time, always reattack and say, hey, look, that's not really what I'm about. I was having a bad day, or whatever the case may be. You always have that opportunity to truly influence, like, hey, this is who I am, and hopefully be accepted because of that. So the final review basically covers, we talked about the statutes and policies. We talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Air Force policy, DoD policy. We covered a bunch of different things in there. We talked about the complaint process and how it does differ between military and civilian employees. We talked about the local data, what's happening on Mountain Home, what's happening in the state of Idaho, if you will. And we talked about trends and what needs to be done to ensure that we are creating a healthy human relations climate on and off base. And then we ended with roles and responsibilities, and the big one being clarify perception versus fact, understand each other, and what we need to do to be a better Air Force. Thank you for your time.